That sharp, icy knot tightens in the pit of your stomach every night at 3:14 a.m., right behind your navel, making it impossible to draw a full breath. You've carried this suffocating weight for weeks, though deep down, you feel it's been rotting there for 20 long years. You've tried drinking hot teas, pacing the garden in the dark, and forcing yourself to believe the lies. But the pressure only grows. Stop fighting this terror. That stabbing anxiety isn't your enemy, but a biological alarm warning you that your foundation is built on shadows. In the next few minutes, you'll see exactly what was breathing behind that locked door. My name is Arthur William Sterling, a 58-year-old senior civil engineer who spent decades designing bridges that could withstand the fiercest storms. I believed my own home was built on the same unshakable foundation of honesty and structural integrity. For 20 years, my life revolved around Evelyn, my wife, whose presence was a fragrant blend of jasmine and vanilla that lingered in our hallways. Losing her to a sudden aneurysm felt like the ground vanishing beneath my feet. This loss reopened a jagged wound from my youth. When my parents perished in a car crash, I survived by pure luck. Now, that old terror of losing control over my own sanctuary has returned with a cold, suffocating vengeance. Our family seemed solid. My son Thomas, a 26-year-old pragmatic lawyer, and Clara, my 22-year-old artist daughter, who always possessed a restless intuition. Every morning at 5:30, I still prepare 2 cups of coffee, a habit I cannot break, before walking the garden for 10 minutes to stare at the locked mahogany door. I want to thank you all for being here during this difficult journey. Please, comment below with the city or state you are watching from today. I truly appreciate your support. Note that some names and details have been fictionalized to protect the legal privacy of those involved, but the emotional core of this betrayal remains entirely real and devastating. It was 3:14 a.m. on April 26th, 2 days after we laid Evelyn to rest. I sat in the kitchen, staring at her empty chair, when I heard a rhythmic, metallic clack-clack echoing from the hallway. My engineer's mind immediately mapped the vibration to the forbidden mahogany door. It was the double wall clock I'd gifted her years ago, 1 dial for London, 1 for our home here in Connecticut. This clock required winding every 48 hours. Evelyn had been hospitalized for 6 days before she passed. Logic dictated the brass springs should have uncoiled into silence. Yet, the steady heartbeat of the gears persisted, mocking her absence with a precision that defied the laws of my physical reality. I approached the door when I noticed another anomaly on the hallway console. A single crystal glass of water sat there, condensation still beaded on its surface like fresh sweat. I always placed her glasses on the left because Evelyn was strictly left-handed, a trait I'd admired for 20 years. However, this glass sat on the far right, positioned with a deliberate right-handed ease that felt like a violation. My stomach twisted. The house was 68 degrees, meaning that glass hadn't been there for more than 15 minutes. There was a presence hiding in my grief. A suspicion without a name began to rot in my chest, whispering that the woman I buried wasn't the only inhabitant inside this home. The morning after the clock's heartbeat shattered my peace, I didn't confront the shadows. Instead, I retreated into the cold, calculated precision of my engineering training. I began a ledger, noting every inconsistency with the clinical detachment I used to assess structural fatigue in steel beams. I stayed in the kitchen, ostensibly mourning, but my eyes never left the hallway console. I watched the dust motes dance in the light, waiting for another glass to materialize, or a floorboard to groan under an invisible weight. Every fiber of my being wanted to scream, to kick down that mahogany door and demand the truth, but I knew that a cornered secret is a dangerous one. I needed more than a feeling. I observed Thomas and Clara during our somber breakfast, looking for cracks in their grief that matched my own. Thomas was buried in legal documents, his pragmatic nature serving as a shield, while Clara's eyes darted toward the hallway every time the house settled. Neither of them mentioned the atelier, yet their silence felt orchestrated, a practiced avoidance that had matured over 20 years of living under a lie. I realized then that my children might not be victims of this mystery, but silent witnesses or perhaps even reluctant accomplices to their mother's hidden life. The thought that my own blood could betray me was a jagged glass shard in my throat, making every swallow of coffee taste like ash. When they finally left, I retreated to my home office and pulled the digital records of our household expenses from the last 5 years. As an engineer, I follow the money. It's the nervous system of any structure. I found a recurring monthly charge of $480 to a medical supply company under a generic wellness label. Evelyn always managed the accounts, and I had trusted her blindly, but now the numbers screamed a different story. These weren't for vitamins or yoga mats. They were for high-grade air filtration filters and specialized medical-grade sanitizers, typically used in sterile environments or long-term care facilities. Why would a healthy woman need a pressurized clean room inside her private meditation sanctuary? I couldn't solve this puzzle alone without losing my mind, so I called Dr. Eris Thorne, a forensic psychologist who had been my confidant since the bridge collapse in 1998. Eris arrived within the hour, her sharp, analytical gaze immediately scanning the hallway where I stood trembling. She didn't offer empty platitudes about grief. She listened as I described the right-handed glass and the clock that wouldn't die. Eris took a seat in Evelyn's favorite chair, her presence bringing a much-needed clinical air to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. She looked at me with a mixture of professional curiosity and genuine concern, her voice steady as she asked the first question that truly terrified me. "Arthur, we need to see what's behind that lock before your mind constructs a monster worse than the reality," she said softly. With the iron key provided by the notary, we finally breached the threshold of the mahogany door. The room didn't look like a meditation retreat. It was a fully functional, self-contained apartment, meticulously maintained and eerily modern. The air was pressurized, smelling faintly of clinical antiseptic and a conflicting mix of jasmine and an unfamiliar sharp peppermint. There were no dusty canvases or meditation cushions here. Instead, there was a sophisticated monitoring system and a small kitchenette that looked far too used for a space meant for solitary prayer and quiet reflection. Iris walked toward the vanity while I stood frozen in the center of the room. She pointed toward the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar. On the marble counter sat 2 identical electric toothbrushes, both slightly damp, and 2 distinct bottles of perfume on opposite ends of the tray. One was Evelyn's signature jasmine, but the other was a deep, musky vanilla I had never seen her wear in public. The walk-in closet revealed rows of clothing in 2 distinct styles: Evelyn's elegant silks and a collection of practical, rugged flannels that she despised. It wasn't just a secret room. It was a habitat designed to sustain 2 separate lives simultaneously, without either ever needing to leave the house. "Look at this, Arthur," Eris whispered, pulling a heavy, leather-bound Bible from a hidden compartment behind a row of medical journals. Tucked inside the pages was a small, fireproof envelope containing a weathered death certificate from March 12, 2006. My heart stopped as I read the name: Sarah Sterling. The cause of death was listed as a catastrophic house fire, and the signature on the document matched our family physician's handwriting perfectly. Evelyn had told me her sister Sarah died when they were children, a tragedy she never liked to discuss. But this document was dated 6 years into our marriage. My wife hadn't just kept a room secret. She had resurrected a ghost. The scale of the deception began to overwhelm my senses as Eris showed me a logbook detailing a rotation schedule. It was a calendar of switches, marking specific dates over the last 20 years, where E became S. I realized with a sickening jolt that the woman who attended my company galas might not always have been the woman who slept in my bed. The conspiracy involved doctors, notaries, and perhaps even the local police who processed that fake fire report 2 decades ago. I wasn't just a grieving widower. I was the primary benefactor of a sophisticated witness protection program run by my own wife. My entire life was a structural failure I had failed to inspect. Eris gripped my arm, her eyes wide as she heard a faint scratching sound coming from behind the heavy oak bookshelf. We weren't alone in this sanctuary of lies, and the person hiding in the walls was clearly losing their patience with our intrusion. The investigation had moved from a search for answers to a desperate struggle for survival in a house that felt more like a prison every second. I have a question for you all watching this unfold right now. If you found evidence that a second person had been living in your home for 20 years, would you call the police or keep looking? Type police or look in the comments below. The scratching sound behind the oak bookshelf wasn't a mouse or the settling of an old house. It was the frantic, rhythmic scraping of fingernails against wood. My hands trembled as I gripped the edges of a leather-bound medical journal, my engineer's heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Eris and I exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated terror as the shelf groaned, revealing a recessed panel equipped with a modern biometric scanner. This wasn't just a hidden apartment. It was a high-tech nerve center, pulsating with the blue glow of hidden servers. My sanctuary was now a surveillance hub, and I realized every breath I drew for 20 years had been monitored by an unseen architect. I pushed past the biometric panel, finding a secondary safe that contained thick stacks of ledgers tied with forensic precision. As I flipped through the pages, the 480 monthly wellness charges I'd discovered earlier seemed like a drop in a vast, dark ocean. There were transfers totaling over $2 million, routed through shell companies that bore the names of my own engineering projects. My signature, my precise professional scrawl, was all over these documents, approving payments for structural inspections that never occurred. I felt a cold sweat break across my forehead as I realized my entire career, every bridge and skyscraper I had built, had been used as a massive laundering machine for a criminal enterprise I never knew existed. The deeper we went into the ledgers, the more the names burned into my retinas. Our family physician, Dr. Holloway, who had treated my children for 2 decades, was listed as a primary consultant for stasis maintenance. He wasn't just treating Evelyn. He was managing a biological rotation between 2 identical women, ensuring their vitals remained indistinguishable to the outside world. Eris gasped as she found a series of pre-signed death certificates, all bearing Holloway's seal, but leaving the names blank. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a professional network of enablers who had sold their ethics to maintain a lie. I was the only one in this house who wasn't part of the payroll, a spectator in my betrayal. The personal risk suddenly shifted from financial ruin to a terrifying question of my own sanity and freedom. Tucked between the ledgers was a legal brief prepared by my son Thomas's law firm, outlining the statute of limitations for vehicular manslaughter and evidence tampering. The document was dated only 3 months ago, proving that my pragmatic son hadn't just discovered the secret. He was actively refining the legal armor protecting Sarah Sterling. My own flesh and blood had calculated the cost of my ignorance and decided that my silence was worth more than my peace of mind. I felt a fissure opening in my soul, realizing the bridges I built were nothing compared to the walls my children erected. Suddenly, a burner phone inside a hollowed-out book on the vanity began to vibrate, its shrill ring echoing through the room like a death knell. I stared at the screen, which displayed a single word: orchestrator. Against Eris's silent protest, I swiped the screen and held the phone to my ear, hearing the familiar, gravelly voice of Theodore Vance, the notary. His tone was no longer the respectful, somber cadence of a family friend. It was sharp, cold, and predatory. "Arthur, you were supposed to wait for the final meeting," he hissed, the threat vibrating through the line. "Touch those files before sunset, and evidence of your involvement in the 2006 cover-up will be sent to the district attorney." My breath hitched as Vance hung up, leaving me in a deafening silence that felt like a physical weight. I turned to the monitoring system, and Eris hit a sequence of keys that brought a grid of surveillance feeds to life. My stomach churned seeing angles of our bedroom, the kitchen table, and the garden path I walked every morning. There were folders labeled with years, 2012, 2015, 2019, containing hours of footage of my most private moments. I watched a clip from last Christmas, seeing Evelyn laugh at my jokes, only for her eyes to go cold the moment I turned. I was a lab rat in a gilded cage, my love the very air that kept the experiment alive. The 2006 incident was finally laid bare in a folder marked with a police evidence seal. It contained photos of a silver sedan, my sedan, with a shattered windshield and blood on the bumper. Detective Miller, the man I had shared drinks with at the local country club, was pictured standing next to the vehicle, holding a bag of discarded clothing. The victim wasn't just a stranger. It was the 20-year-old son of the governor, a tragedy that had been wiped from the public record with surgical precision. Sarah had been the driver, but the network had used my influence and my pristine reputation as the shield. I realized then my freedom was an illusion maintained by men who owned my past. The risk was now absolute. If I exposed Sarah, I would go down as the architect of the cover-up, losing my firm, my children's futures, and my own liberty. The structural integrity of my life was failing at the foundation, and there were no beams strong enough to hold up the weight of this truth. Eris gripped my hand, her eyes darting toward the door, as we heard heavy footsteps approaching from the hallway outside the atelier. We were trapped in a room built on lies, surrounded by evidence that condemned me just as much as it did the woman I mourned. Every second in this sanctuary was a second closer to a confrontation that would end in arrest or collapse. The footsteps stopped directly outside the mahogany door, and the sound of a secondary key turning sent a jolt through my spine. The scratching behind the bookshelf ceased abruptly, replaced by a low, melodic hum that I recognized as Evelyn's favorite lullaby. I need to warn you right now. What we discovered behind that shifting bookshelf is deeply disturbing and may change how you view family loyalty forever. If you are sensitive to themes of extreme psychological manipulation and dark betrayals, this might be the moment to look away. But for those who need to know the truth, stay with me, because the shadow emerging from the darkness is a face I thought I had buried recently. The panel slid back with a mechanical hiss, revealing a woman crouched in a small, padded alcove lined with monitors. My knees buckled as I stared at a face that was a mirrored distortion of the one I had kissed in the casket just 48 hours ago. It wasn't a hallucination born of grief. She was breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked bursts. I felt a cold, oily nausea climb my throat as I noticed she was holding a glass of water in her right hand with effortless familiarity. The woman I buried on April 24th was strictly left-handed. Yet this creature before me moved with a right-handed ease that shattered my entire physical reality. "Arthur," she whispered, and the vibration of her voice was a physical blow to my sternum, a frequency resonating with 20 years of shared secrets. She didn't look like a captive. She looked like a queen abdicating a throne of shadows. As she stepped forward, the musky vanilla scent overwhelmed the antiseptic air, a sharp contrast to the jasmine I associated with my wife's public persona. I realized with horror that the woman I mourned, who died of a sudden aneurysm at 4:12 p.m. last Tuesday, was actually Sarah Sterling. My real wife stood before me, terrifyingly alive, having orchestrated her own sister's funeral to bury the legal consequences of 2006 forever under 6 feet of dirt. My mind raced back to our 10th anniversary dinner at Vinny's Bistro, when Evelyn stared blankly at the waiter when he asked about our favorite vintage. I laughed it off as stress, but now I saw the truth. That was Sarah, the sister, struggling to mimic a life she was only half living. Every time my wife went on those month-long charity retreats to Vermont, she wasn't helping the poor. She was retreating into this pressurized sanctuary while her twin took her place in my bed. The betrayal wasn't a single act. It was a rhythmic, daily exchange of my affection. A biological shell game where I was the only player who didn't know the stakes of the gamble. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed my cheek, but I recoiled as if her skin were molten lead. I looked at the monitoring screens, seeing the empty hallway where my children, her children, were likely waiting for me to emerge with closure. Did they know? Did Thomas code the legal loopholes for the woman in the casket or the woman standing here? I stood at the threshold of my sanity, an engineer staring at a bridge that had already collapsed. Before I confront this woman and decide if I am a widower or a protector of a fugitive, I need to know you are still with me. Are you still here watching? Type present in the comments right now. I didn't walk into that confrontation alone. I brought the heavy machinery of the law to dismantle the structure of her lies. Detective Miller stood to my left, his face a mask of professional regret as he realized the 2006 bribe was no longer enough to buy my silence. Thomas and Clara were behind me, their eyes red from the realization that their entire childhood was a curated performance. I held the leather-bound Bible and the forensic audit in my trembling hands, my engineer's heart demanding a final clinical accounting of the damage. We moved toward the mahogany door, not as family, but as a wrecking crew ready to level a 20-year-old monument built on a foundation of betrayal. Evelyn, or whoever she was in that moment, stood by the vanity, her hands clasped in a gesture of practiced vulnerability I had once mistaken for grace. She tried to weave a final web of manipulation, whispering that every switch and every fake death certificate was a sacrificial act of sisterly devotion. "Arthur, I did it to keep our world from collapsing," she cried, her voice cracking with a manufactured tremor that no longer moved me. She reached for my hand, attempting to bridge the chasm with the ghost of a love that was never truly mine. I stepped back, the jasmine scent of her perfume now smelling like the rot of an abandoned construction site in the rain. When she realized my logic was as unyielding as reinforced concrete, the mask of the grieving widow finally shattered into jagged, ugly pieces. Her voice dropped 2 octaves, turning into a snarling confession that stripped away 20 years of simulated affection. She admitted to the 2006 hit and run, describing the governor's son's final moments with a chilling clinical detachment that made Clara gasp in horror. She screamed that she deserved the luxury, the safety, and the identity, because she had the strength to take what others were too weak to hold. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by a calculating architect of misery who viewed human lives as mere materials for her own survival. The explosion of her ego was her final structural failure, and Detective Miller didn't hesitate to deploy the handcuffs. The metallic snick of the steel around her wrists was the most honest sound I had heard in this house in 2 decades. He didn't offer her a graceful exit. He read her rights in front of the children she had used as pawns in her long-term biological shell game. Dr. Halloway was already in custody across town, his medical license revoked for facilitating the stasis maintenance and falsifying the official records of Sarah's death. The network of enablers was collapsing in real time, and for the first time, I felt the internal pressure of the house begin to equalize. The justice was as precise as a blueprint, carving out the cancer that had hollowed out my life for so long. Evelyn was sentenced to 25 years for vehicular manslaughter and conspiracy, while the Sterling firm was ordered to pay $3 million in restitution to the victim's estate. Every cent of the laundered wellness funds was frozen, and the shell companies I had unwittingly signed into existence were dismantled by federal auditors. Even Theodore Vance couldn't escape the wreckage, facing a decade for notarizing the fraudulent fire reports that sustained the lie. The legal system, which had been bent for 20 years, finally snapped back into place, delivering a verdict that was cold and final. As the police cars pulled away, leaving our driveway in a sudden heavy silence, Clara walked over and took my hand. We stood in the garden where I had spent 10 minutes every morning staring at a lie, but today, the sun was cutting through the Connecticut fog with a surgical clarity. The mahogany door remained open, the sanctuary now just a room filled with empty clothes and discarded perfume bottles. I looked at the bridge I had designed in the distance, still standing firm despite the storm that had leveled my private world. My heart was a construction site again, messy and painful, but at least the ground beneath my feet was finally, undeniably solid. It is October 15th, 2026, exactly 6 months since the mahogany door was unhinged, and the pressurized silence of that sanctuary was finally exhaled into the autumn air. I have spent this time rebuilding the structural integrity of my family, piece by painful piece, starting with a new home where every room is open to the morning light. Clara's recent paintings no longer feature faceless women. Instead, they are filled with the vibrant, messy colors of a restored reality. We visited the cemetery yesterday, placing a single branch of jasmine on the headstone that now bears the correct name. My old terror of losing control has transformed into a quiet acceptance that life must be allowed to breathe.